Look out. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Home Recording Made Easy.com podcast. My name is David Vignola. This week, we're going to pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about monitors for your studios and subwoofers. I have a really special guest. We have Josh Estock from Focal, the director of marketing at Focal USA. Josh is going to talk to us about studio monitors and what to consider when picking up new studio monitors and the pros and cons to subwoofers and acoustic treatment and so much more. So we got an expert in the industry going to help us with choosing studio monitors. So sit back, relax, get yourself a cool drink, and let's listen to part 1 of 2 of my interview with Josh Estock from Focal right here on the Home Recording MadeEasy.com podcast. Well, everyone. Welcome back to the Home Recording MadeEasy.com podcast. This is episode number 51, I believe. 51. This is episode 51, I think, of our podcast. Thank you so much for coming back and listening to another episode. Now, this is going to be part 1 of 2. This is a 2-part episode. We're going to do this week. We're going to do part 1 next week. We're going to do part 2. And as I said in the little intro there, you heard we're going to talk to Josh Estock, who works for Focal. And oddly enough, he also used to work for Sweetwater and used to be my personal sales engineer, which is an interesting little fact. A few weeks ago, we had a podcast episode talking about studio monitors and subwoofers. And seeing as I'm in the middle of, and have been in the middle of, building out my new analog workflow over Mixing Music Analog. Some of you may have known about that. And if you don't know about that, check out mixingmusicanalog.com. Link will be in the show notes below. And I am setting up my new system, and I've already have been using Focal monitors, my Solo BE6s for about 7 or 8 years now. And I love them. But I'm going to be going into a bigger mixing space soon enough. And I wanted to upgrade my monitors, and I wanted to stick with Focal. Maybe get something with a little more power, a little bit bigger woofer. Wanted to try out some different Focal monitors. So, wanted to talk to someone at Focal about that, and oddly enough, Josh happens to work there. So I wanted to talk to him about that. And as I started to talk to Josh, we talked about this would be a great podcast episode to talk to people about the different series of Focal monitors, everything from the entry level affordable to the crazy, insane, expensive, and everything in between. And more importantly, for all of our listeners, what do you consider when you're choosing new monitors for your studio, for your home studio? And we talked a little bit about this in the last podcast episode, a couple of podcast episodes ago. You heard my opinions, but now we're also going to talk to someone who's in the field of selling monitors, that understands acoustic treatment, understands speaker design and how it all works. And we're going to get a lot of great information. So this was about an hour conversation I had with Josh. We're going to split it up into 2 episodes here. This week will be part 1 and next week will be part 2. So if you're someone that's in the market for new studio monitors, whether you like Focal or not, although I would highly recommend you at least check out Focal because their speakers are outstanding. They sound amazing. I'm a big supporter of them. But all the information you're going to hear in this week and next week episode really doesn't matter whether you choose a Focal monitor or any brand. A lot of the same principles all the principles we talk about are going to apply. Everything from speaker placement, acoustic treatment, the pros and cons of subwoofers, and so on and so forth. So this was really cool. Josh is a really great guy. He knows his stuff. And I highly recommend that you sit back and relax. This episode will be a little bit longer than normal, and next week's will be as well. And take some notes and really understand the whole way speakers really work in your studio. And even if you're not in the market for buying new monitors, just understanding what the proper placement is, just understanding how to get your mixes to translate and how important acoustic treatment is and how big of a room you need if you want to have a certain size speaker in your room. All that information is going to absolutely help, and all that stuff is very critical to getting your mix to translate outside of your studio. And we talk in depth with Josh about that. So that's what we're going to do this week. So make sure you sit back and relax. All the links for everything will be in the show notes below. If you have any questions, you can certainly email me through the website. So right now, let's talk with Josh. And let's talk about studio monitors right here on the Home Recording MadeEasy.com podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to homerecordingmadeeasy.com and also mixingmusicanalog.com. And you're going to be on the YouTube channel and the podcast. And this week we got a really special guest. We're talking to Josh Estock, who is the North American Pro Director of Focal. Now, the interesting thing about Josh is that Josh also used to work at Sweetwater and was my personal sales engineer. So a lot of you know that I've been on the market now looking for some upgraded monitors. I currently use in my studio the Focal Solo B6Es with the subwoofer, the Focal subwoofer, and they're fantastic. And I think Josh is the one that actually turned me on to Focal about 7 or 8 years ago. And since I've started to build out this new mixing studio, I thought maybe I'd like to upgrade my monitors, and I want to stick with Focal. They got some new models out, and I've been working with my good buddies over at Sweetwater. So this is kind of a for lack of a better word, sponsored video between Sweetwater and Focal and myself, and we're working together to try to find the best monitor for me. So between Josh and Sweetwater, we have a couple of different monitors that we're going to be listening to and looking at over the next several weeks. We have obviously my Solo B6s. We have the Solo Twin BE, which is the step up. We're also going to take a look at some Shape monitors by Focal, which I'll talk to Josh about, which is the less expensive monitors for people that are interested in getting into the Focal line. And then we're also going to take a look at the Trio. I think the Trio 6s we're going to take a listen to as well. And we're going to have all 4 sets of monitors up in the studio, and we're going to flip back and forth. And I'm going to decide which set of monitors do I want to upgrade to. I have a feeling it's not going to be the less expensive Shapes. It's probably going to be the Twins or the Trios, but that's okay. It's really, really cool. And I love Focal, and I've been a big supporter of them for a long time. So Josh, thank you so much for joining me today here and helping us out with some things that we're going to talk about as far as what we should be looking for in monitors and giving some people some information if they're in the market for monitors. What kind of things should they be looking for, right? So thanks, Josh, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a small world. It comes full circle sometimes.
It really is. So in the way this kind of happened was I was talking to Tyler over at Sweetwater, and we were discussing this whole monitor shootout thing. And the way this kind of happened, for people that don't know, is I got the Twins. You don't see them; they're over my shoulder here, though. And I was listening to the Twin 6s against my Solo 6s, and I thought the Twin was just going to be the same monitor with an extra driver because it looks exactly the same. I thought it would be exactly the voice the same. It would just be a bigger cabinet, maybe a little more low end. And when I compared them back and forth and couldn't believe how much of a stark difference of the sound, especially in the mid range, I said to Tyler, "Let me talk to someone at Focal. Do you know anyone I can talk to?" And he had said, "Yeah, Josh is now working at Focal. Wasn't he your sales engineer at one time at Sweetwater?" And I says, "Yes." And that's how we kind of hooked up. So it really is a small world. It really, really is.
Yeah, I don't know if I can't remember if I sold you the Solo 6s originally or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, even before I worked here, I was when I started working at Sweetwater, literally the first thing I bought as an employee was a pair of Solo 6s.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not totally full of it.
They're fantastic, and I think you did sell them to me. It's about that time frame. It's been about 7 years I've been.
I don't remember. I hope so.
They're fantastic speakers, and so when I was on the lookout for my new monitors, I have no desire to even listen to other brands, and I know there's a lot of great speakers out there, but I love the Focal sound, and particularly the Beryllium tweeter, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about. I just think with a bigger space, I might want a bigger set of speakers, or it's just an excuse for me to spend money that I really don't have to begin with. But hey, I can't take it with me, so we may as well try to enjoy it while we have it. Yeah. So Josh, what I'd like to talk about, maybe, because there's a lot we've talked about this on my podcast before. I've done YouTube videos on it. We've talked about this in live streams with some of my students, talking about monitors. And I have opinions on monitors, and I'd love to get some of yours. I'd like to talk about a few topics today. First of all, let's talk about, you have really 3, I guess, series, if you will, of monitors, right? You have the Shape series, and then you have the Solo or the series, and then you have the Trio series, right? Can you talk a little bit about those 3?
Yeah. Well, and there's actually, if we're looking at it in that way, there's almost 4 series. So our very introductory line, we have a series called Alpha Evo. That's I wouldn't say entry level necessarily, but kind of the best speaker we feel like we can make at the least expensive price point that we can justify having. So those come in kind of between $400 a pair and $800 a pair, depending on the size of the model and all that stuff. Then you have the Shape series, which is definitely a step up from that. Those are made in France, just like everything else, with the exception of the Alpha series. And then we have SM6 series, and SM6 is really kind of broken into two components, as you mentioned. You've got the solos and the twins, and then you've got the Trio 6 and the Trio 11. Okay. So those are kind of in the same series, but yeah, the Trio nomenclature isn't super clear there.
Right. And what are kind of outside of the price points, right? And there's something for everyone there, but what are kind of the main differences? Like, what's the difference between the solos and say the trios outside of, maybe I know some of them have a couple extra drivers? What is there any, because all the speakers, when again, foolish me looking at them, they look the same, and you look at the driver and you look at the tweeter and you go, they look identical. It's just in a different cabinet. Is that really not true? Or what are the real differences between them?
Yeah. So there's kind of a number of different, a number of differences, and it's kind of based on our approach, right? We kind of look at things when we're designing things in more of a use case scenario, right? Like who's the customer? In terms of, obviously the price is going to dictate who can afford certain things, unfortunately, in the grand scheme of things. But beyond that, like, what situation are they actually using these speakers in? Are they in a small space where they need to listen close? Are they in a bigger space, a large control room where they need high SPL level, or a lot of low end extension? And if so, how far away are they from the speakers in that situation? And we kind of scale those in a way where we feel like we can deliver a similar experience in terms of linearity and clarity and all those things, but just get bigger. So what you'll find, for instance, in SM6 is you start with the Solo 6, which is a single two-way driver, right? And then gradually you notice as you move up in the series, you get to the Twin 6, like you mentioned, that has a two 6.5-inch drivers and a 1-inch tweeter, where you don't necessarily get more low end. You'll get some more output, but you actually gain more efficiency, right? Because in a two-way speaker, you've got that one driver that's handling all the mid-range content, 2.5K and down, and then all the bass content. So there's a certain amount of efficiency. That driver is doing a lot of work. It's covering a lot of sonic, area, if you will, versus something like a twin. It's actually splitting that load up of all of that low end information, that mid range information. So there's more efficiency, right? If you have a really, really long, a 40 hertz cycle, if you're talking about the amount of energy it requires, it takes 10 to 15 times as much energy to reproduce a 40 hertz tone than it does a 1K tone, right? So if you imagine a woofer, one driver trying to do this in a broad sweeping motion and at the same time do this,
right,
it's a lot harder for that. So what happens is the low end can, in some cases, mask the mid range of things. So that's what you're hearing in a Twin 6, where you jumped up and you said, "Oh, the mid range is a lot more present." Well, it's actually because those two drivers are sharing that load. One driver's managing everything 200-ish down, and then the other one's handling everything else. So it just kind of allows more efficiency in the grand scheme of things. And then you move up to Trio 6 and Trio 11, which are true three-ways. Once again, adding more efficiency, adding bigger cabinets, bigger drivers, so it can effectively reproduce that sound, signature, whatever program materials coming in, going out as accurately as possible.
Right. So, and when you have the three drivers, I guess then the crossover points are going to be different as well, right? So when the twin, you have those two mid-range drivers, they're going to be crossed over at different points. Correct. Are the speakers, for lack of a better word, are they tuned different than like what's in the Solo, or is it just simply by having that second driver, you're taking over some of the low end duties and therefore being more efficient, and therefore that's why the perception is that it's more mid-range pushed, if you will, or more open in the mid-range than say the Solos? Or are they tuned differently? Is it what?
It's all crossover. So for instance, with the twin, and it depends on how you have them switched. So on the back of the twin, you'll notice there's a left and a right switch that will change what each driver's fed, right? So there's three dedicated amplifiers in that speaker, but they're crossed over differently. So one driver's handling actually 240 down. The other one is handling everything 2.5K and down. So they're splitting up that low end the duty, if you will, and which just allows for that mid-range to operate a little more freely. But they're the same driver. The amplifier topology on each speaker is the same. They're just crossed over differently to kind of subdivide those duties in a way that's more efficient.
So it is the same speaker. So is that correct? Same thing with the Beryllium tweeter? Is that the same tweeters in both those models?
Sure. Well, yeah. So the Solo and Twin have the same drivers. When you go to the Trios, they do not have the same drivers. But the tweeter on all of them, even though they look similar on the surface, they're not necessarily the same because the voice coil behind them could be a little overwound on one. The magnet structure may be a little bit larger because you need to create a higher SPL level. But for the most part, the driver material and the tweeter material is the same on the Solos and Twins. And then when you go to the Trio series, the Trio 11. And 6 share the same tweeter, but the mid-range and the low frequency drivers are different.
It's completely different, right? And also,
the same philosophy behind all of it, right? In the grand scheme of things, it's Focal. When you get into the grand scheme of how we make speakers, right? It's kind of a comparison of 3 components, right? And it's like how heavy that driver is, the mass of that driver, how rigid that driver is, meaning because if it flexes, it's going to distort, whether it's audibly or it's just making it, it's creating unlinear artifacts in one way or another, right? And then dampening. So how much tone that material makes on its own, right? Because if you run energy through reason we use beryllium because it has pretty much no resonance. If you run a signet or a tone through titanium rings. I literally have pitchforks to illustrate this, but it rings. You run the input tone in, the input tone stops. It's going to ring for a certain amount of time after. Beryllium it has next to no resonance, but that's also why it's expensive. So that's kind of part of it. It's all making sure those 3 kind of fundamental components are a match and can kind of meet certain price points where we find they're most efficient sonically and from a cost perspective too.
Yeah, and I think that beryllium tweeter in the Focal, it's that Focal sound, right? So I mean, what that really pleasant top and that really non-brittle kind of top ends is because of that beryllium tweeter, and that's what makes that the Focal has that specific sound that sounds completely different than anything else I've ever heard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting material. It's like it's super expensive. It is a natural, like if you go back to high school chemistry class and you look at the periodic table, beryllium is a pure element. So, but yeah, it has very unique properties. We have all the tooling that we use to form those is done in house. We literally get them in sheets. So, and they're press formed and laser cut and all this stuff. But it definitely has a sonic signature. We're the only ones who use beryllium really at this point in time. I'm sure that's probably because of patents and stuff too, but
right.
But I mean, there's some benefits of it. It's just really, really light. It's really, really rigid, and it, like I said, the damping tone. So you can listen to it forever without it fatiguing your ears.
Yeah. That's one thing I noticed with those is I can listen and mix all day long at reasonable volumes, and you don't feel ear fatigue. And that's one of the reasons why I really love them. So now we have these 3 different types of series and at all different price points and all the different engineering. So if someone's in the market for choosing for monitors, what do you tell people when they say, look, I'm in the market for monitors? I mean, what are the first kind of things that they should consider? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, right? I mean, what do you, I mean, I think, a lot of people, they want to get the biggest speaker with the biggest cabinet, the biggest thing they can afford, but that isn't always the right thing to do, right? So what things would you consider when you in the market for monitors? Yeah,
totally. And honestly, it's funny you mentioned that somebody wants the biggest thing. I try to talk people off the cliff all the time. It's like, hey man, it's not often a guy tells you to spend less money, but I'm telling you, you don't need this huge thing all the time. Now, maybe there's some cases where you do, but the first question is in my mind, what are you trying to accomplish? Is the goal to wow a client on the couch in the back of the room? Okay, because if that's the case, maybe it's a different conversation than if you're trying to, do one pass mixes and never do a recall in your life, and never have to take it out to the car, listen, or never have to audition here or there or wherever. Those are 2 different things. But normally the conversation is, I want a really transparent speaker that delivers a reliable result. That's what we do. We make studio monitors, right? So there shouldn't be any secrets there. But so that's usually the first question is intent. And the second question is, how big is your space? Right. How much room treatment do you have up in the wall? Because frankly, the room is part of your monitoring environment, whether you want to believe it or not. It's between your ears and the speaker. So unfortunately, the room has a pretty significant impact on the way speakers sound. I've seen people, I've literally had people message me like, hey, I just had my room retreated and they'd sound like totally different speakers. Because the room can totally compromise the way you're experiencing everything. So, and by that token, buying the biggest speaker and putting it in a teeny tiny untreated room is not a good investment. Not a good use of your money.
Right.
So
Right.
So it's just trying to maximize that relationship in a way for the customer that makes sense for them. Because maybe somebody's in a situation where they can't treat a room the way they want to treat it. Maybe they're in an apartment, or maybe they're a student and they live in a dorm room. They can't put stuff on the walls. There's considerations, in those cases I'd say, yeah, let's maybe look at a smaller speaker that you can sit closer to. So there's less room interaction, those are all kind of key components before we even go into speakers or models or anything like that.
Right. So I think and if the room isn't going to work for you, and I say it all the time, acoustic treatment's huge. If you can't acoustically treat the room, you'd be better off buying a good set of Focal monitoring headphones for $500, $600, $800 or whatever, and mixing on a really good set of headphones as opposed to putting a really nice set of speakers in an untreated room, right? Because I think most people that that are looking for monitors, there's two things that probably they have in common. One, they probably don't have the largest space, right? If we're in a home studio environment, we're probably in a 10 by 10 space, 12 by 12 space, or maybe like a basement of some kind, right? And number two, we probably have some acoustic treatment, but it's probably not professionally tuned the room, right? It's probably some bass traps and maybe some absorption. So when we talk about room size, if you have like a 10 by 10 or a 12 by 12, and let's say you had it adequately acoustically treated, for lack of a better word, where from the speaker size standpoint, where do you kind of like guide people? Is it, I would assume if it's a 10 by 10 space, it's not the Trio 11, right?
Yeah,
probably not.
Yeah, definitely not. Is what I would definitely not recommend that. Right. But some people just want to go for it, which I understand. But
I get it.
But yeah, I think you have to look if you're in a room like that. There's a couple tools you can go. If you Google like a room mode calculator, you can look at, like, for instance, a 10-foot deep room, a 40 hertz tone. I keep mentioning 40 hertz tone because it's just easy, but tuned to A440, a 40 hertz tone is like 20 to 22-ish feet long for a single cycle, right? Which means if your room's 10 feet deep, you're pretty much going to be almost exactly out of phase in the middle of your space. Right. If you don't do something to accommodate that. So once again, the speaker size thing, usually if you look at the lowest frequency in the frequency range that we provide in the specification, which is how accurately can the speaker reproduce, usually it's a 1K tone at 1 meter within this frequency spectrum. It's usually within a dB. So something, for instance, like a Solo 6 goes down to 40 hertz.
Right.
That's why I use it as a reference. So it's still going to cause some low frequency issues in that space, no matter what you do. But there's some certain things you can do to mitigate some of those issues, right? Your playback level is really, really critical. The more energy you pump into that room, the more exacerbated those anomalies are going to be. But yeah, in a situation like that, I probably typically recommend something like a 5-inch or 6.5-inch driver in those cases. A lot of guys are doing, who may be doing like rock stuff or EDM stuff or something that's really, really bass heavy. There's a fundamental conflict there, right? Because they want to hear 30. But what they're hearing at 30 is never going to be accurate no matter what they do. So I think in that case, a set of headphones are a good example. But in a room that's treated, I think a 6.5-inch driver in that territory is really great. But you also have to ask yourself, how far are you going to be from your speakers too? Right. So that's a good question. So how far away should you be from your speaker? And because if, let's say, you're in a square room, which is a typical bedroom, how far away, does it really matter how far away from the front wall? Like if you're sitting in front of your mixing station and your speakers are pointed at you, there's a wall probably in front of you. Does it really matter how far away the monitor is from the wall and how far away then you're sitting from the speaker? Yeah, it can. all this stuff. There's a multitude of variables, right? But yeah, it absolutely can. In a situation like like that 10 by 10 bedroom you're referring to. Mm-hmm. A lot of cases putting a speaker closer to that rear wall, the concern is a lot of older speakers used to be rear ported. So that low end information would push up against the wall and you have bass buildup. And you're going to have that from any adjacent surface, whether it's a wall or a desk. You're going to get kind of some sort of resonance that's going to increase the interaction of the space. So that's true. But depending on the depth of the room, sometimes putting a speaker closer to the wall can actually be a good thing because you're limiting the number of low frequency nodes that fall into a space and any phase anomalies that may happen there. So, but good rule of thumb, where I tell everybody to start is you use the 38% rule. If you're not familiar with the 38% rule, I'm probably not the best person to explain it. But when you talk about any space, you go into the space, say the length of the room is 10 feet, as you said, from front to back wall. Your mix position should be approximately 38% into the front 38% or the rear 38% of your space. Right. Why that is, I don't know, but there's a bunch of acousticians who are way smarter than myself who can tell me the exact reasoning for that. But my understanding is it's that percentage does a good job mitigating room interaction and room anomalies in terms of just the average square or rectangular box, right? So start at that 38%. If it's 10 feet, that means you're going to be 3.8 feet away from your back wall, right? Mm-hmm. And then from there, you depending on your desk and your setup or whatever, you want to draw an equilateral triangle between your ears and the speakers, right? So that equilateral triangle could be 2.5 feet away. That equilateral triangle could be 5 feet away if you're talking about the rear 38%, right? It really just depends on how that's set up. But those are kind of the two things, is just figure out where you're going to end up in that space, and then make sure you have an equilateral triangle so information from the left speaker or the right speaker isn't hitting your ears out of phase or before another in terms of delay. Because if it's your left speaker is closer to your left ear than the right one is, and your hearing is the way it should be, if the left speaker is closer, you're going to perceive that snare drum that's pan center a little left.
Right.
And that vocal a little left because it hits your ear a little bit earlier, right? So
that's right.
So it's kind of starting there and then moving forward, I think is usually the best course of action to kind of figure that out. And then, that also kind of dictates how big of a speaker you're going to need too, because if your effective listening distance is say you only have an arm's length between yourself and your speaker because of your room dimension, a bigger speaker is typically intended to throw that signal further, right? And the effective listening distance of something like, we have a little Shape 40 that's like a little 4-inch driver speaker. Within an arm's length, it sounds, you would never even know it's a 4-inch driver. Like you'd be like, wow, this is a 6.5-inch driver. It's a pretty big size speaker. If you had your eyes closed, whatever. The moment you move further out than an arm's length, all of a sudden your low end just starts falling off. That speaker just isn't designed to be used further away than that. And the same thing is true of a bigger speaker. If we had a twin 6 and you were within an arm's length, it's probably too close. You really need to be a bit further back. So it's very situation dependent. I know that's kind of gray, but
no, that's good. So that's a good rule of thumb. So it's about 38% away from that front wall, say 3.8 feet away, and then and then the perfect triangle, which people we've talked about a lot on our podcast. And then with acoustic treatment, again, if the room is only 10 feet deep, as you said, unless you have bass trapping in those corners and some other kind of diffusion or some other kind of absorption on that back wall, that low frequency is going to hit that wall, it's going to come back, and it's going to bounce back. We need to absorb that as much as possible. And the same thing with the front wall, right? That's why the acoustic treatment is so important, because it'll make all of this, any speaker by any brand, not sound its optimum. If you don't have the acoustic treatment in the right spot, you'll think the speakers don't sound right or they don't sound great, and it's not the speaker, it's your environment, right?
Yeah, 100% of the time. The conversation where the guy's like, man, I mixed, I mixed the track, it sounded great in my room. I took it out in the car, and it's like I either had way more bass than I was expecting, or not enough, or there was no bass at all.
That's right.
That's just a room mode, and how far or in or out of that room you're sitting is going to be dictated by that. And it could be the front 38%, it could be the back 38%, but you typically want to avoid anything kind of halved in a room dimension, too. But yeah, bass traps are killer. But even bass traps in a small space like that, there's really not much you can really do, even below 80 hertz, unless you just have the space for a lot of mass, because that's the only thing that stops it really, is mass and just different types of material.
Right. So the deeper your room is, the better off you're going to be from a low end point of view, right?
Perspective. Yeah, typically. Just because it has room to dissipate, right? And it's really just phase, right? It's just low end. It's just low end canceling itself out in your room. So if I keep harping on this 40 hertz tone just because it's an easy reference, but if your room is exactly 22 feet deep, and let's just assume that this tone's exactly 22 feet deep. It isn't. It's approximately that. But all of a sudden, the phase relationship at that frequency is perfect. It's not out of phase at all. So you're never going to have an issue with 40, in a scenario like that. In terms of phase. Now, in terms of frequency response, it's a whole different thing. But yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot there. So I guess the takeaways are, if you're looking for monitors, the first thing you want to do is, well, what size space are we going into, right? How far away can you be sitting from your speakers, depending on your room situation. The 38% is a great way to start, and that may or may not work perfectly in every situation. But so how far away are you going to be sitting away from those speakers, and how much acoustic treatment are you able to and willing to put into that room to be able to, and then once you have those three things figured out, if we're talking about a 10 by 10 space, you're saying like a 6.5 speaker or smaller is probably the way to go. 8, 10, 12 is probably not going to be conducive to that small. When you start getting up into that 8-inch woofer or larger, you probably need a room that's twice the size, right? So you probably need like a 20-foot plus depth room, and maybe even a 15 or 20-foot wide room, right? You almost need double the space in order to get, acoustically treat and set yourself up in a position where those speakers are going to sound the way you would intend them to sound, right?
Yeah, ideally, and I think anybody who's making the investment in a set of studio monitors who doesn't have treatment, or think of it as one big thing, and I know that's a little more daunting because acoustic treatment's not fun to buy.
That's not sexy. I know that.
Yeah, it's just not, it's not exciting, but you really should think of it as, and frankly, probably invest a little bit more in the treatment side of things. There's whether you're doing a DIY thing, which you can certainly, there's a lot of really great DIY resources out there to build your own panels, or you're buying pre-made panels from some company. There's a lot of resources out there, companies who do free room evaluations and things like that, who can help you kind of understand a little bit more about your room specifically. But yeah, I think you have to take a really holistic approach. If your concern 100% is this thing translating to the outside world.
Well, I think for mixing, right, that's probably the biggest. That's probably the biggest challenge. Is you want to be able to, whether you're mixing for clients or just mixing your own music, you want to be able to, as you said, take your mix on a CD or a thumb drive, or however we do it today. Leave your studio, put it in the car, and have. And this in the low end is always the challenge. It's not normally the mids and the highs, but it could be. But it's really the bass. What you think it sounded like is really what it sounds like when you go bring it to other systems. Yeah. And that has everything to do with acoustic treatment, the room, and everything that we're talking about. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that first part 1 of 2 of our interview with Josh from Focal. A lot of great information there. You may want to go back and re-listen to it again and really consider a lot of the things that we talked about, studio monitors and the placement and acoustic treatment in the room. And we've talked about these things a million times in the podcast, different episodes, especially acoustic treatment. We've talked about it on live streams together. You've seen it on videos on my YouTube channel. And you guys have written me lots of emails talking about this topic. So it is really important. It's not just buy a great set of sounding speakers, drop them in your room, and everything is going to work itself out. There is a bunch of planning. There's a bunch of thought that goes into it to really get the best result. And at the end of the day, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably someone who mixes music, at least on some level, whether it's your own or someone else's. And if you want that mix to translate, a lot of these points that we talked about today absolutely ring true. So I hope you learned something today, and I want to thank you so much for joining me. Now, make sure you subscribe to this podcast, because next week we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to jump into the topic of subwoofers and how that plays a role in all of this. So make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast. If you're watching this or listening to this on YouTube, make sure you give me the old thumbs up and hit that notification bell. Now, because you stuck around till the end of the episode, I want to make sure that I give you guys something for sticking around. So if this is your first time here, go out to homerecordingmadeeasy.com. Make sure you get your free mixing course that's on the website. website. It's worth about $100. It's my gift to you just for visiting homerecordingmadeeasy.com. If you really dig my training and you like that course and you want to check out some of my other paid training courses, I want to give you a discount. The discount coupon code that you can use at checkout is podcast30. That'll give you a 30% discount on any training course on my website. Again, link in all the stuff will be in the show notes below. So until next week, where we pick up our conversation with Josh from Focal, I've been Dave with the homerecordingmadeeasy.com podcast. Thank you so very much for listening and watching, and I'll talk to you guys really soon. See ya.